I hadn't been camping since Mike died. The thought of being out in the wilderness again, away from everything, alone with my thoughts, it scared me. But I was running out of ways to cope. So, when I saw the Palo Duro Canyon trip, the one Mike and I always talked about, pop up in an old email chain, I knew I had to do it. For closure, or at least something close to it. It had been a year since the accident. 1 year of pretending I wasn't broken. Everyone said time would heal, but time wasn't doing anything for me. I figured maybe getting out there, being in the place we dreamed of, would help. Mike loved the outdoors, and so did I once. But I hadn't set foot in a national park since the funeral. The drive out was long, and the Texas sun was relentless. I pulled into the park late in the afternoon. The golden hour casting the canyon in deep reds and purples, the rock formations towering over me like ancient giants. It was beautiful, just like we had imagined. I parked the RV in a quiet spot, well away from the other campsites. Solitude. That's what I needed. That's what I told myself, at least. I got out, stretching my legs, breathing in the dry, warm air. The canyon seemed to go on forever, an endless sea of red rock and scrub. There wasn't a sound except for the faint rustle of the wind. The place was peaceful, but it had a weight to it, a kind of stillness that pressed on your chest, made you feel small. I wanted to enjoy it, but all I could think about was Mike. We had always planned to come here together. It was supposed to be our big brotherly adventure. Now, I was doing it alone. That first night, I sat by the campfire, the flames crackling softly in the cool desert air. I stared into the fire, thinking about all the things I should have said to Mike, the apologies I never made, the trips we never took. The guilt gnawed at me, a constant ache that I couldn't shake. As the fire burned down to embers, I heard something. A voice, faint and distant, carried on the wind. Jack. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The canyon walls around me made it hard to tell where the sound was coming from, but it had sounded like someone calling my name. I stood up, straining to listen, but the wind had picked up, and all I could hear was the rustling of dry leaves and the faint echo of the canyon. Jack. There it was again, closer this time, but still distant. It was probably just the wind, I told myself. Palo Duro was famous for its acoustics. Voices carried weird out here, bouncing off the rocks in strange ways. Still, the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I didn't sleep well that night. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I figured a good hike would help clear my head. I grabbed my gear and set out early, making my way down into the canyon. The trail was rugged, winding through narrow passages between the towering red cliffs. The sun beat down on me, and soon I was drenched in sweat, but it felt good. It felt right. For a while, I managed to lose myself in the hike, letting the landscape pull me out of my thoughts. The canyon was beautiful, breathtaking even. The kind of place that made you feel like you were stepping back in time. I could almost hear Mike beside me, cracking jokes about the heat, complaining about the lack of cell service. It made me smile, even though it hurt. By mid-afternoon, I found a small overlook and sat down to rest. The view was incredible. Miles of canyon stretching out beneath me, the red cliffs glowing in the sun. I sat there for a long time, staring at the horizon, trying to imagine what Mike would have said if he were here. And then I heard it again. Jack. This time there was no mistaking it. Someone was calling my name. I stood up quickly, looking around, but the trail was empty. I was completely alone. Jack, come find me. My heart lurched in my chest. The voice, it sounded like Mike. I swallowed hard, shaking my head. This was impossible. Mike was gone. He'd been gone for a year. I felt cold despite the heat. I tried to tell myself it was just the canyon playing tricks, that the echoes were distorting the sound. But deep down, I knew. It wasn't just the wind. I knew my brother's voice. I started walking, my legs moving before my brain could catch up. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to follow the sound. I had to see. Maybe it was the grief talking. Maybe it was desperation, but I couldn't stop myself. What if Mike was out there? What if this was some kind of message? Jack, this way. The voice led me deeper into the canyon, down trails I didn't recognize, into narrow ravines that seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. The sun was getting lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the rocks, but I didn't care. I had to find him. The farther I went, the more disoriented I became. The trail I was on didn't look familiar anymore, and the landmarks I thought I recognized kept shifting, as if the canyon itself was playing tricks on me. And the voice, Mike's voice, was getting louder, closer. Come on, Jack. I'm right here. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized how far I'd wandered. The canyon was dark now, the sky overhead full of stars, and the temperature had dropped fast. I hadn't brought a flashlight, hadn't brought any gear. I'd been so focused on following the voice that I hadn't thought about anything else. And then, suddenly, the voice stopped. I stood there, breathing hard, staring into the darkness. The silence was overwhelming, pressing in on me from all sides. My heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline still surging through me. But there was nothing, just the sound of the wind howling through the canyon. Mike? I called out, my voice hoarse. No answer. I felt a wave of panic rising in my chest. I was lost. I didn't know where I was, didn't know how to get back. And the voice, Mike's voice, was gone. For the first time since I'd started walking, I felt truly alone. Then, from the darkness ahead, I saw it. A figure, just standing there at the edge of the ravine. Jack. It was Mike, or at least it looked like him, but something wasn't right. His face, it was shadowed, distorted. I took a step back, my skin crawling. Mike? I whispered. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there, staring at me with eyes that didn't belong to my brother. And then the voice changed. It wasn't Mike's voice anymore, it was something else, something dark and twisted. You shouldn't have come here, Jack. My breath caught in my throat. The figure stepped forward and I stumbled backward, my legs barely able to keep me upright. The canyon walls seemed to close in around me, the darkness swallowing everything. Come with me, Jack. The voice echoed, bouncing off the canyon walls, filling my head with noise, with memories, with guilt. I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran for. The trails twisted and turned, leading me in circles. But I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to get away from that voice, from that thing pretending to be Mike. By the time I made it back to the RV, the sun was starting to rise. My legs were shaking, my chest heaving with every breath. I slammed the door behind me, locking it tight, as if that would keep whatever was out there from following me in. I collapsed on the floor, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my ears. The voice was gone, but the echoes of it were still ringing in my head. The next morning, I packed up and left the canyon without looking back. The open road stretched out before me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a strange sense of relief. I didn't know what I had heard in the canyon or what I had seen, but I knew one thing for sure. Mike was gone, and it was time to let him go. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the canyon, watching me leave. But when I blinked, it was gone. The desert had a way of making you feel small, alone. I like that about it. After all, that's why I came to Joshua Tree National Park in the first place, an escape from everything. My job was going nowhere. My relationship had fizzled out months ago, and I hadn't done anything remotely exciting in far too long. I needed space to breathe, to think, to reset. So I packed up the RV and headed out into the desert for a solo trip. No plans, just me, the open road, and the stars. By the time I pulled into a remote corner of the park, the sun had already begun sinking behind the jagged rock formations, casting long shadows across the desert floor. I parked my RV at a spot away from the main campsites, exactly the kind of isolation I was craving. I wanted quiet, time to think and figure out what the hell I was doing with my life. I sat outside, cracking open a beer as I watched the sky turn from pink to deep indigo. The stars were starting to come out, twinkling brighter than they ever did back in LA. It was just me and the vast desert stretching out before me. No distractions, no noise, just peace. But then, I noticed it. Something strange in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. Small orbs glowing faintly in the twilight, bobbing above the horizon. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe headlights from a distant car, but no, the lights didn't move like that. They were slow, deliberate, and they hovered in place for a few seconds before disappearing altogether. I sat up straighter, intrigued. I'd heard stories about strange lights in the desert, legends, really, but I'd never believed any of it. Maybe I was just tired. I took another sip of beer and leaned back, figuring it was just one of those weird optical illusions that happened out here, the kind of thing the desert did to mess with your head. But that night, lying in my RV, I couldn't stop thinking about the lights, the way they moved, calm, almost purposeful. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me after a long day of driving. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next day, I set out to explore the park. Joshua Tree was beautiful, like another planet with its towering rock formations and strange twisted trees. I spent hours hiking, snapping photos, and letting the sun warm my face. It was exactly what I needed. The freedom of being out here, alone, was a kind of therapy. But the lights kept coming back into my thoughts. By the time dusk started to settle again, I was back at camp, cooking dinner on the small propane stove I'd set up. The quiet of the desert was comforting, a heavy silence that pressed in from all sides. I stared out at the vast horizon, the last bit of daylight fading, and there they were again. The orbs, just like the night before, glowing faintly in the distance, but tonight they seemed closer. I stood up, watching them carefully, trying to figure out what they were. They didn't seem threatening. In fact, they were almost beautiful, mesmerizing. I grabbed my camera, trying to capture the moment, but no matter how I adjusted the settings, the pictures didn't come out right. Every shot was blurry, the lights smudged across the image like I'd shaken the camera. Frustrated, I put it away and sat back down, staring at the lights as they slowly drifted across the horizon. But then they vanished again, leaving me in darkness. That night, something strange happened. I woke up suddenly, my heart racing, drenched in sweat. I grabbed my phone to check the time, midnight, but when I looked at my watch, it said 3 a.m. What the hell? I muttered to myself, sitting up in bed. Had I really lost the 3 hours? It didn't feel like it. My mind was hazy, as if I had just woken from a vivid dream, but I couldn't remember any of it. And then I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, coming from outside the RV. I froze, holding my breath. Was someone out there? Slowly, I crept to the window and peered out into the desert. The lights were back, closer this time. They hovered just at the edge of my camp, glowing faintly like they were watching me. My heart pounded in my chest and I backed away from the window, unsure of what I was dealing with. My rational mind told me it was some kind of natural phenomenon, nothing more. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something I couldn't explain. By the third night, the lights weren't just a distant curiosity anymore. They were a problem. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear something. Whispers, faint footsteps, the low hum of electricity that wasn't there. And every time I looked outside, the lights were closer, almost circling the RV now, like they were waiting for something. During the day, I tried to leave. I figured maybe it was time to pack up, head back to civilization and shake off whatever weirdness was happening out here. But when I tried to start the RV, nothing happened. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. I tried again. Same result. My phone had lost signal too. No bars, no way to contact anyone. And my compass, the one I always carried for hiking, had started spinning wildly, unable to find north. It was like the desert had swallowed me whole. By dusk, I was growing desperate. I needed to figure out what was going on. So, stupidly, I made the decision to hike toward the lights. I thought maybe I could find some explanation, some clue as to what they were. I strapped on my boots and grabbed my flashlight, setting off into the desert just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The lights were already visible, glowing softly in the distance. I followed them, keeping my eyes trained on the horizon, determined to get close enough to understand what I was seeing. But the farther I walked, the stranger things became. The landscape around me started to warp. Rock formations I'd passed earlier in the day seemed to have shifted places. Trails that had been clear suddenly vanished, leading me in circles. It was like the desert was playing tricks on me, twisting my sense of direction. The lights stayed just out of reach, always moving farther away, no matter how fast I walked. Panic set in. I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar anymore. The desert stretched out in every direction, vast and empty, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I was lost. The lights had lured me away from camp, away from safety. I stumbled through the darkness, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my flashlight flickering as the batteries began to die. I was alone. Completely, utterly alone, except for the lights. They were still there, watching me. Always watching. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV. One minute, I was stumbling through the desert, half crazed with fear, and the next I was standing in front of the RV, my legs shaking beneath me. I collapsed inside, locking the door behind me, as if that would protect me from whatever was out there. The lights hadn't followed me back. Not yet. I tried the engine again. Nothing. My heart sank. I was trapped. That night, the lights came closer than ever. They surrounded the RV, casting an eerie glow through the windows. I sat there, huddled on the bed, listening to the whispers. They were louder now, almost intelligible, as if the lights were trying to communicate with me. But what did they want? I don't know how long I sat there staring at the lights. Minutes? Hours? Time didn't seem to matter anymore. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here. I had to leave, or the lights would consume me. Grabbing my flashlight, I bolted out of the RV, running into the desert without a plan, without a destination. The lights followed, surrounding me, blinding me with their glow. I could hear the whispers now, louder, more insistent. Come with us. I stumbled, falling to my knees, gasping for breath. The lights swirled around me, disorienting me, pulling me in every direction. I tried to fight it, but I was powerless against them. In that moment, I realized the truth. The lights weren't just some strange natural phenomenon. They were alive, and they were leading me somewhere. I felt myself slipping away, my mind unraveling as the desert swallowed me whole. I don't know how much time passed. Days, maybe. Weeks. But when I finally woke up, I was back in the RV, lying on the floor, my head pounding. The lights were gone, but I knew they hadn't left me. Not really. They were waiting, watching, and someday they'd come back for me. I'd always liked the desert, the stillness, the emptiness of it, how the land stretched on forever, undisturbed. It felt like a place where nothing could touch me. No people, no problems, just me and the open sky. That's why I'd come to Red Rock Canyon, pulling my RV into one of the most remote campgrounds in the park, miles from anyone. Exactly how I liked it. The sun was starting to set as I finished setting up my spot, the last rays of light casting a red glow over the rocks. The colors were intense, almost surreal. Reds, oranges, purples. But the silence was what really got me. It was that kind of quiet that buzzed in your ears after a while, like the world had just stopped. Perfect. I popped open a beer and sat back in my folding chair, looking out over the vast stretch of desert. Just me and the land. I'd been coming out to spots like this ever since my divorce. To get away. To reset. Being in the city just made things worse. Too many people, too much noise. The desert didn't judge, didn't crowd me. There was another RV parked a ways off, maybe half a mile. I could barely see it from my sight, which suited me fine. One of the perks of off-season camping, nobody around to bother you. I settled in for the night, letting the quiet wrap around me. I'd hiked Red Rock before, but I wasn't here for that this time. This trip was just about sitting still, maybe having a few too many beers and letting my head clear. But that night, as I sat by the campfire, I started hearing it. Voices. Faint, distant. At first, I thought maybe it was just the wind, the desert playing tricks. It had that way about it, like it could talk if you listened too long. But the more I sat there, the more certain I was. They were voices. Human voices. I stood up, looked around. The other RV was too far for me to hear anyone from there, and there shouldn't be anyone else out here, not this late in the season. I shook my head and sat back down. You're hearing things, Mark. The desert does that. I'd been on edge ever since the divorce, half paranoid all the time. That's why I was out here, right? To let it go. But the voices kept on, just a whisper, like something carried on the wind. I didn't like it. I turned in early, telling myself it was nothing, just my brain playing tricks. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. Something moving outside the RV. Footsteps, maybe, or rocks crunching. I'd sit up, flashlight in hand, ready to catch some desert critter messing around my camp. But every time I looked, there was nothing, just the empty night and the wind. The next morning, I told myself I'd imagined it. Just nerves being out here alone, too much time inside my head. I got up, stretched, and figured I'd take a short hike to shake it off. The trail from the campsite led toward the canyon, and after about an hour, I came across the other RV. I hadn't been planning on checking it out, but my feet led me there anyway. There were 3 people standing outside the RV, all of them facing away from me, just standing there in the open, like statues. I don't know why, but it made me uneasy. I called out, trying to be neighborly. "Hey there. Beautiful day, huh?" Nothing. They didn't even turn around. "Hello?" I tried again, taking a few steps closer. One of them finally moved. A woman, I think. But the way she turned wasn't natural. It was like her body hadn't quite figured out how to bend properly, her movements jerky, slow. When she finally faced me, her eyes were vacant, staring right through me. The other two turned next, just as weird, their faces blank. It wasn't just like they were tired or zoned out. It was like they weren't there. "The desert speaks," the woman said, her voice low and flat. "It calls you to fill it." I didn't respond. Couldn't. My mouth went dry, my heart thudding in my chest. I don't remember turning around or walking away, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was back at my RV, shutting the door behind me like something had chased me the whole way. What the hell was that? I sat there for a long time, staring out the window, trying to calm my nerves. It was just weird. People got weird sometimes in the desert. Too much sun, not enough water. That had to be it. Just heat stroke, or maybe they were on something. I wasn't in danger. It was fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The way they'd looked at me, if they'd even seen me, left me unsettled. That night, it started again. The footsteps, the voices. But this time, they weren't distant. They were right outside my RV. I sat up, heart pounding, listening as something or someone moved around my camp. Tap, tap, tap. A slow, deliberate knock on the door. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my flashlight, standing in the small space between my kitchenette and the door, and shined it through the window. Nothing, but the knocking didn't stop. I held my breath, waiting, trying to rationalize it. Animals? No, animals don't knock. People? That made even less sense. Nobody was out here but me and those campers. But they hadn't seemed right. Not at all. The tapping moved to the other side of the RV, like someone dragging their hand along the metal. And then I heard voices. The same flat, empty voices I'd heard earlier. "Let us in. The desert calls." "No," I whispered to myself, my pulse racing. "You're not real. You're not real." But they were. The tapping, the voices. They wouldn't stop. When I finally worked up the nerve to peek out the window again, I saw them, standing there in the darkness. The three campers. Except they weren't right. Their bodies were wrong. Too tall, too stretched out, like their limbs didn't fit anymore. Their eyes were hollow, black pits in their faces. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. They were real. They were here. "What do you want?" I shouted, not expecting an answer, just trying to make the panic stop. "We were empty," one of them said in that same flat tone. "We filled ourselves. Now we are hollow." I didn't know what they meant, but it didn't matter. I grabbed the closest thing I had to a weapon, a crowbar I used to fix the RV on, and held it in front of me like it would actually help. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. They were trying to get in. I backed into the kitchenette, breathing hard. My phone didn't have signal out here. No way to call for help. No way to run. The RV felt like a coffin. Too small, too fragile. Then I remembered what the old man at the gas station had said when I filled up. He'd laughed when I told him I was camping alone. "Be careful out there, son. Some folks don't come back right from the desert. They get hollowed out, empty." I'd laughed it off at the time, just some old legend, but now it didn't seem so funny. The knocking stopped. The silence was worse. I crept to the window again, flashlight in hand. I didn't want to look. I had to look. They were gone. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The quiet pressed in on me, suffocating. The RV felt too small, too fragile. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't just drive away. Not in the dark, not with whatever was out there. I waited, breathless, until dawn's first light peeked through the window. The sun brought no relief. The desert looked the same. calm, still, but I knew it wasn't. I had to leave. Whatever those things were, I couldn't stay here another night. I grabbed my keys, ready to make a break for it. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine stalled. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood and saw it immediately. Something had been messing with the engine. Wires were ripped out, scattered across the ground. Panic surged through me. I was stuck. I gathered what supplies I could, water, a flashlight, the crowbar, and bolted. I wasn't waiting around to be hollowed out by whatever was out there. I'd hike out if I had to. I didn't get far before I heard them again. The voices, the same drone and chant, closer now. I looked back and saw them, 3 figures standing on the ridge watching me. They didn't move, just stood there, their heads tilted slightly, those black, empty eyes following me. I ran. The desert stretched on endlessly, the heat rising in waves, but all I could hear were those voices. The desert speaks. It calls you to fill it. I stumbled over rocks, my legs burning, lungs screaming for air, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The hollow ones weren't far behind. They didn't have to chase me. They just had to wait. Finally, just as the sun was starting to dip again, I saw movement up ahead. People. Real people. A small group of campers setting up near a trailhead. "Help!" I shouted, my voice hoarse, waving my arms like a madman. They turned, confused, but they saw me. Real people, not hollow. I stumbled toward them, collapsing in the dust at their feet. When I looked back, the ridge behind me was empty. The hollow ones were gone. For now. The campers helped me to their car, driving me into town. I barely spoke, my mind still reeling from what I'd seen. I knew one thing for sure. Those things, whatever they weren't done with me. As I drove away from Red Rock, I could still hear it. The tapping, the voices, the desert calling me back. It would never let me go. The first thing you notice about Mount Hood is the silence. Not the pleasant kind either. No birds, no wind, just an eerie stillness that settles deep into your bones. I told myself it was fine. I was here for the solitude after all. Just me, my camera, and the wilderness for the next few days. No distractions, no people. Perfect. I'd park the RV in one of the more remote spots by Lost Lake, away from the usual trails and tourists. The place was supposed to be a haven for wildlife, and I had 3 days to capture something spectacular for the contest I was entering. I'd planned this trip for months, and I needed these shots to be great. After all, this was why I came out here, to capture the wild, untamed beauty of nature, to get away from the city and all the noise in my head. I set up camp quickly, getting my gear ready before the sun dipped too low. The air was crisp and the towering trees around me cast long shadows over the clearing. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had clung to me since I'd arrived. It was just nerves, no big deal. I'd been on countless trips like this. Besides, what was there to worry about? I was alone, absolutely, perfectly alone. That was the point. I grabbed my camera and hiked a little way into the forest. The dense foliage was gorgeous, the way the late afternoon light filtered through the trees, casting everything in a soft golden hue. But after an hour or so of snapping photos, I started to feel it again. That gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach. I was being watched. I paused, lowering the camera, scanning the trees. Nothing, no movement, no sound, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I turned back, quickening my pace to camp, telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination. Being alone in the woods could do that to you, make you paranoid. But still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. Back at the RV, the sky had already darkened, and I decided to call it a day. I sat down, reviewing the photos I'd taken, flipping through each shot. That's when I saw it. Something in one of the photos just at the edge of the frame. A shape, a figure standing between the trees. What the hell? I zoomed in, squinting at the screen, but the image was too blurry to make out any details. Just a dark outline, tall, human-like. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or my own shadow caught in the shot. But that feeling crept back in, stronger this time, crawling up my spine. I shoved the camera away, trying to focus on anything else, but the quiet outside was unnerving. It was too quiet. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just the heavy silence pressing in around me. As the night went on, the unease grew worse. I couldn't sleep. Every sound, or rather, the lack of sound, kept me on edge. I lay there in the RV, listening, waiting. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the RV. I sat bolt upright, my heart pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the windows. Nothing. But the footsteps continued. Soft, crunching sounds like someone or something was walking in the dirt just outside. I stood there, frozen, gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles turned white. "Hello?" I called out, instantly regretting it. The footsteps stopped. Dead silence. I waited, holding my breath, my mind racing. Then the footsteps started again, moving away this time, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I tried to shake off the fear. It was probably an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer or a coyote. That had to be it. Still, I felt unsettled, like the woods were watching me, waiting for something to happen. I packed up my camera and set off for another hike, determined to distract myself. The forest felt different that day. The air was heavy. The trees seemed to close in around me, casting dark shadows even in the midday sun. As I walked, I noticed things that hadn't been there before. Strange markings on the trees, like claw marks, and small piles of rocks stacked in unnatural ways. I took a deep breath and kept moving, trying to focus on the task at hand. But no matter how hard I tried, the feeling wouldn't leave me. That sensation of being watched, followed, stalked. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the trees, but there was never anything there. That evening, as I returned to the RV, I found fresh footprints around my camp. Human footprints. I stared at them, my mind racing. I hadn't seen another person out here since I'd arrived. The footprints circled the RV, just like the footsteps I'd heard the night before. I bent down, examining them closely. They were too fresh to be old, too deep to be my own. My throat tightened, and I stood up, backing away from the prints, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone, or something, was out there, watching me. That night, the silence was even more oppressive. I locked the RV door, checked it twice, and sat there, waiting for something to happen. I didn't have to wait long. The footsteps came again, circling the RV slow and deliberate. But this time, there was something else. A whisper, faint but unmistakable. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like it was coming from all around me. Echoing through the trees, seeping into the RV, I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just the wind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The whispers grew louder, clearer. "You shouldn't be here." I jumped up, my skin crawling. My breath came in short, ragged bursts as I grabbed the flashlight again and peered through the window. And that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching me. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs and no discernible features. Just a dark, humanoid shape, barely visible in the dim light. But its presence was undeniable. It was staring right at me, even though it had no face. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. My mind screamed at me to run, to get in the RV and drive the hell out of there, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring at the thing standing in the shadows. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Leave this place. I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled to the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, then died. No, 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 I muttered, turning the key again. Nothing. The engine wouldn't start. Panic surged through me, my thoughts spiraling out of control. I was trapped. I glanced out the window again, hoping the figure had disappeared, but it hadn't. It was still there, watching, waiting. My heart pounded in my ears as I grabbed my camera and stumbled out of the RV, my mind racing with desperation. If I couldn't drive out, I'd hike. I'd run. But as soon as I stepped outside, the forest closed in around me. The trees seemed to shift, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The trail that had been so clear before was gone, replaced by a maze of shadows and branches. I was lost. The whispers were louder now, surrounding me, suffocating me. You shouldn't have come here. I ran, my breath ragged, my legs burning. But no matter how far I went, the forest didn't end. The trees loomed over me, closing in tighter, and that figure, the watcher, was always there, just at the edge of my vision. It didn't need to chase me. It didn't need to catch me. It was everywhere. I stumbled, falling to my knees, gasping for air. I couldn't escape. The forest wouldn't let me. The watcher wouldn't let me. In that moment, I realized what it wanted. I had disturbed something, crossed a line I hadn't even known was there. The land wasn't mine to take, to photograph, to capture. The watcher was here to remind me of that. It wasn't just a guardian, it was a judge. With trembling hands, I pulled the camera from my pack and placed it on the ground. An offering, a surrender. The whispers stopped. The forest stilled. I stood up slowly, backing away from the camera, my heart still racing. The figure was gone. The watcher had disappeared, but its presence lingered, a warning etched into the silence. I found my way back to the RV. The path suddenly clear again, and I didn't waste any time. The engine roared to life on the first try, and I drove out of Mount Hood without looking back. As I left the forest behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even as the trees disappeared in the rearview mirror. The watcher wasn't done with me. Not yet. I had trespassed, and the wilderness doesn't forget. I stood at the edge of the trailhead, breathing in the cool autumn air of Pisgah National Forest. The trees around me were turning brilliant shades of red and gold, as if the entire landscape was painted in flame. It was quiet, peaceful, exactly what I needed. After everything that had happened with Sarah, I needed this time alone. 3 days of hiking through the Appalachian wilderness would help clear my head, help me forget the fights, the constant nagging anxiety that seemed to follow me everywhere since the breakup. Here, in the mountains, it would be just me and the wilderness. I shouldered my pack and glanced down at my map one more time before heading out. The Art Loeb Trail was famous for its challenging terrain and stunning views. The ranger at the station had warned me that the trail was a bit rough this time of year, with fewer hikers and colder nights. Perfect, I thought. The less human contact, the better. The first day went smoothly enough. The trail wound through dense trees and the occasional clearing, offering breathtaking views of the surrounding mountains. The colors of fall spread like a carpet across the ridges, and the rustle of leaves underfoot was a soothing, rhythmic sound. I lost myself in the hike, letting the miles slip away as I climbed higher into the forest. But as the sun began to set behind the mountains, A chill settled in the air. I found a flat spot near the trail to set up camp and wrestled with my old tent, which hadn't been out of storage since last summer. When I finally got it up, I noticed a small tear along one of the seams. "Great," I muttered, pulling out some duct tape to patch it up. The temperature was dropping fast, and the last thing I needed was cold air leaking into the tent all night. I tried not to think about how my sleeping bag wasn't exactly rated for freezing temperatures either. I could manage, I told myself. This was what I wanted. Solitude, quiet, a few days to clear my head. The forest around me grew darker as I built a small fire and prepared a quick meal. The flames crackled softly, casting flickering shadows around the trees. I ate in silence, listening to the sounds of the woods. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, its call echoing through the trees. Everything seemed normal. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there, wrapped tightly in my sleeping bag, the cold creeping in from the torn seam of the tent. Every time I started to drift off, I heard it. A faint noise, like footsteps, just outside the tent. I froze, my heart racing, straining to listen. The sound was faint but deliberate, like someone or something was walking around the perimeter of my camp. I unzipped the tent slowly and peered out into the darkness. The fire had died down to embers, casting a dull red glow over the clearing. Nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees, but there was no sign of anything. Just the soft rustling of the wind through the leaves. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a raccoon or a deer maybe. But the sound had been too rhythmic, too precise. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. The unease I'd felt since leaving civilization gnawed at me, keeping me awake. By morning, the feeling hadn't gone away. I told myself it was just nerves, maybe a leftover feeling from everything I'd been dealing with in my personal life. I packed up camp quickly, eager to keep moving, but something felt off as I hiked through the forest. Every now and then, I heard that same faint noise, footsteps or maybe branches snapping, but always just far enough away that I couldn't be sure. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was never anything there. The trail was more remote than I expected. The ranger hadn't been kidding when he said this time of year brought fewer hikers. I hadn't seen a soul since setting off. The day passed slowly. My legs ached from the climb, and by late afternoon, I started looking for a spot to set up camp for the night. I found a secluded clearing just off the trail, set back in the trees. It was eerily quiet as I pitched my tent and built another fire, the only sound the crackling of the flames. As I cooked dinner, I heard it again, low, almost imperceptible, but definitely there, a humming sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it had a rhythm to it, almost like a low chant. The sound seemed to echo off the trees, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. I stood up, scanning the woods around me. The forest seemed darker than it had the night before, the shadows longer, thicker. My fire barely pushed back the darkness, and the humming seemed to grow louder the longer I stood there, heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, feeling a bit ridiculous. The humming stopped. The sudden silence was more unnerving than the sound had been. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees, but the beam seemed swallowed by the dense undergrowth. My heart was racing, my palms slick with sweat. It wasn't just nerves. Something was wrong. That night, I barely slept again. The cold was worse than the first night, and the patch I'd made on my tent wasn't holding up. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I heard something moving outside, just beyond the firelight. I kept the flashlight clutched in my hand, but every time I checked, the camp was empty. In the morning, I found my pack had been moved. It wasn't where I'd left it the night before, beside my tent. Instead, it was about 20 feet away, half open, with some of my gear scattered around. My food bag, which I'd hung in a tree to keep away from animals, had fallen to the ground, but nothing was missing. Not a single thing. The food was untouched. The items from my pack weren't disturbed, just moved. I stood there for a long time, staring at the scene, trying to make sense of it. It didn't look like an animal had done this. There were no claw marks, no sign of chewing. It felt deliberate, like someone had been in my camp, going through my things. But why leave everything behind? A knot of dread tightened in my chest as I packed up my gear. I needed to move, to keep going. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, following me. The trail seemed longer that day, stretching on endlessly through the thickening forest. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the trees themselves were closing in around me. The humming returned as I hiked, growing louder with every step. It was unmistakable now, a low, droning sound that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath my feet. My head throbbed with the noise, and no matter how fast I walked, it followed me. I stopped by a stream to refill my water, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the trees on the other side of the stream. Tall, dark, and motionless, like a shadow among the trees. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A stump, maybe. But then it moved. I froze, my heart slamming against my chest. The figure didn't move closer, but it didn't leave either. It just stood there, watching me. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze. The humming grew louder, vibrating in my skull. I backed away, not daring to take my eyes off the thing in the trees. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. The figure remained still, its outline barely distinguishable from the shadows of the forest. But it was there. I knew it. I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran, my pack bouncing on my shoulders, the world blurring around me. I could still hear the humming, even as I put distance between myself and the stream. It was inside my head now, pulsing in time with my racing heartbeat. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, the forest was silent again. I was miles from where I'd seen the figure, but the dread remained. I didn't stop to make camp that night. I kept moving, too afraid to stop, too afraid of what might happen if I stayed still. By the time the sun began to set, my legs were burning, my throat dry and raw. I stumbled into a small clearing and collapsed against a tree, my body aching from exhaustion. The forest around me was quiet, but the humming was still there, low and insistent, vibrating through my bones. I fumbled for my map, trying to figure out where I was, but the lines blurred, the landmarks meaningless. I couldn't remember the last time I'd checked the trail markers. Had I missed a turn? Panic surged through me. I was lost. Lost in the heart of Pisgah, with night closing in and someone following me, watching me. The figure from the stream flashed in my mind, those glowing eyes staring at me from the trees. The Boojum. I hadn't believed the stories when the ranger had mentioned it offhand at the station. Local legend, he'd said. A ghost or spirit that haunted the Appalachian Mountains, guarding its treasure. I'd laughed it off, like a tourist hearing an old wives' tale. But now I wasn't so sure. I scrambled through my pack, looking for anything to protect myself. My knife was small and dull, but I clutched it anyway. My flashlight flickered as I turned it on, casting weak light into the surrounding trees. And then I saw them. Eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness just beyond the edge of the clearing. Watching. Waiting. The humming grew louder, a deafening roar inside my head. I staggered to my feet, gripping the knife with trembling hands. The Boojum didn't move. It just watched, those glowing eyes locked on me, unblinking. I took a step back, then another, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. The boojum stepped forward, its shadowy form shifting, almost blending into the darkness around it. My breath caught in my throat as it stopped just at the edge of the firelight, close enough that I could make out its tall, gaunt figure, but still shrouded in shadow. Then I remembered. The ranger had mentioned something else, something about iron. Old stories said spirits could be warded off by iron. I searched my pack frantically, my mind racing, and there, buried at the bottom, was an old rusty nail, probably left over from an old campsite. I grabbed it and held it out toward the boojum, my hand shaking violently. For a moment, nothing happened. The spirit stood there, watching me, unmoving. Then, slowly, it began to retreat. The glowing eyes faded into the shadows and the humming grew quieter, softer, until it was just a distant murmur. I stood there, my heart still racing, clutching the rusty nail like a lifeline. The boojum was gone, but the forest was still watching. The Black Hills were supposed to be my escape. A week off the grid, away from the suffocating grind of my job, the emotional mess from my breakup, and the endless noise of the city. Just me, my RV, and the quiet solitude of the forest. I thought if I could just get away for a while, maybe I could clear my head. Reset. That was the plan, anyway. I arrived at Black Hills National Forest late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low over the towering pines. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. The kind of silence you don't get in the city. I parked my RV at a secluded campsite miles from the main road. No other campers, no tourists, just the trees and the open sky. It felt like the perfect place to disconnect. Except I wasn't really disconnecting. Sure, I told myself I'd unplug, but I had my satellite phone, my GPS, and my portable radio. I liked the outdoors, but I liked knowing technology was there to keep me safe. You know, just in case. After setting up camp, I checked my gear. The radio crackled to life with the familiar hum of static. The GPS pinged my exact coordinates, and my phone showed full signal. Everything working as it should. Satisfied, I sat down by the fire, watching the sky turn from deep blue to orange and purple. The stars slowly appearing one by one. It was perfect, or at least it should have been. That night, as I lay in bed, the silence of the forest wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you notice every little noise, the creak of the RV, the rustle of the wind, and then something else, a faint crackling sound. I sat up, rubbing my eyes. The radio was on. I was sure I turned it off before bed, but there it was, hissing with static. I climbed out of bed and flicked the dial, trying to tune it out. But as I adjusted the frequency, I heard something. Faint. A voice, maybe. Garbled, like it was coming from miles away. I leaned in closer, straining to hear. The voice was distorted, barely audible through the static, but then, just for a second, it cleared. Nate, come closer. I froze. My name. Someone had said my name. I yanked my hand back from the radio like it had burned me, my heart pounding in my chest. Who the hell was out here, calling my name? I turned the radio off and sat there in the dark for a long time, listening, waiting. Nothing. The forest was silent again. Just my imagination, I told myself. Maybe a transmission bouncing around in the airwaves, distorted by the hills. That had to be it. Still, it took me a while to fall back asleep. The next morning, I shook off the weirdness of the night before. It was just a glitch, technical interference. I had brought all this tech with me after all. There were bound to be bugs. That's what I told myself as I brewed coffee and checked my phone for messages. One unread text. That was odd. I hadn't heard my phone go off, and I shouldn't have been getting any texts out here, at least not from any normal service. I opened the message, my stomach nodding as I saw it was from an unknown number. "You're not alone out here." Attached was a photo of the forest, of my campsite from just outside the RV. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it. I hadn't taken this picture. A wave of panic surged through me, and I burst out of the RV, scanning the trees. Nothing, no sign of anyone. But whoever or whatever had sent the message had been standing right there, just a few feet away, watching. I circled the campsite, looking for footprints, anything that might give me a clue, but there was nothing. No tracks, no sign that anyone had been here. The only thing I had was the photo on my phone. I spent the rest of the day on edge, trying to rationalize what was happening. Maybe someone else was out here, messing with me. Or maybe my phone was acting up, sending old data somehow. It didn't make sense, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next night, things got worse. It started with the GPS. I had been using it to track my hikes, mapping out trails through the forest, but now it was acting strange. It showed me moving when I was standing still. I watched, confused, as a little dot marking my location drifted off the trail, wandering into the woods, despite the fact that I hadn't moved an inch. Then the radio started up again. That same low static, a garbled voice hidden beneath it. My heart raced as I reached for the dial, turning it off. But the voice, it was louder this time. "Nate, don't trust the path." I staggered back, the radio buzzing with a life of its own. I slammed it off, yanking the batteries out just to be sure. My hands were shaking, my pulse thundering in my ears. And then my phone buzzed. Another message. This time, it was coordinates. GPS coordinates, leading to a spot deep in the forest, miles from where I was camped. I stared at the screen, my mouth dry, dread pooling in the pit of my stomach. The text wasn't signed, just the coordinates and one more sentence. "Come find me." Against my better judgment, I packed a small bag and set out, the glow from the phone screen lighting my way. I don't know why I followed it. Maybe I was desperate for answers. Maybe I just wanted to prove that this was all some kind of prank. The further I walked, the stranger things became. The air felt thicker, heavier, like it was pressing down on me. The trees seemed to shift in the darkness, their branches curling like claws. My phone's signal flickered, and the GPS dot jittered across the screen. And then, just as I neared the coordinates, the phone went black. I stood there in the dark, miles from my RV, with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Panic clawed at my chest. I tried turning the phone back on, but it wouldn't respond. Then the radio, still in my pack, burst to life. "We see you, Nate. You can't run." I dropped the pack, heart pounding, and turned, sprinting back the way I had come. I didn't care about the trail anymore, didn't care where I was going. I just knew I had to get away, but the forest didn't feel like it wanted to let me go. Every path I took led me back to the same spot, the trees warping and twisting around me like a maze. My phone remained dead, the GPS useless, and the radio kept crackling with those distorted voices. "You're ours now." By the time I stumbled back into camp, the sun was rising. I was soaked with sweat, my muscles aching, my throat raw. I collapsed against the side of the RV, panting, trying to catch my breath. For a moment, I let myself believe that it was over, that I had escaped. But then I heard it again. The radio, still inside the pack I'd dropped, buzzing faintly with static. I approached it slowly, dread settling over me like a shroud. The voice that came through was clearer this time, more distinct. "You belong to us, Nate. I grabbed the radio and hurled it into the trees. Then I took my phone, smashed it against the side of the RV until it cracked and the screen shattered. I wasn't going to let this thing control me anymore. But even as I destroyed the devices, I knew it wasn't enough. The signal wasn't just in the radio, or the phone, or the GPS. It was in the air, in the forest itself, twisting the world around me. I needed to get out, now. I threw my gear into the RV and jumped into the driver's seat, hands shaking as I turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life. Relief washed over me as I slammed the RV into gear and tore down the forest road, gravel kicking up behind me. But as I sped away from the campsite, the dashboard lit up with a warning. The radio, built into the RV, flickered on, static filling the cab. "You can't escape, Nate. We'll always be with you." I kept driving, ignoring the voice, refusing to look at the radio. My heart raced as the trees blurred past and I pressed the gas harder, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that cursed place as possible. Hours later, when I finally reached the main road, the radio went silent. The static disappeared and the voices stopped. But I knew it wasn't gone. Not really. As I drove away, I glanced at the shattered phone sitting in the passenger seat. The screen was dark, the glass broken, but for a brief second, I thought I saw it flicker, just a blink, like a pulse. The signal wasn't done with me yet. It was supposed to be a peaceful trip. Just me, my RV, and the solitude of the Ouachita National Forest. I'd been looking forward to this escape for weeks. Work had been a nightmare, and things at home were, well, I didn't want to think about that. Out here, it was just me and the trees. Silence, peace, exactly what I needed. When I first arrived, the forest felt like a sanctuary. The tall pines loomed above me, casting long shadows across the forest floor. There wasn't a soul for miles, just the way I liked it. I parked my RV at a secluded spot, far off the beaten path, and set up camp. A small fire, a folding chair, and a cold beer in my hand. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The sunset was beautiful, painting the sky in oranges and purples. I watched the light fade behind the trees, and as darkness fell, the fire became the only source of light, flickering softly in the cool night air. The forest around me was quiet, almost too quiet, but I didn't mind. It felt good to be alone, or at least I thought I was alone. I don't know when I first started feeling it. Maybe it was when the wind died down and the night grew still, but somewhere in the back of my mind, that creeping sensation began, the feeling of being watched. I tried to shake it off. I was deep in the woods after all. It wasn't unusual for the quiet to mess with your head, but as I sat there, sipping my beer, I couldn't shake the nagging sensation that something was off. The fire crackled, and I stared into the flames, trying to ignore the growing unease. Then I heard it. Faint footsteps, a soft crunch of leaves behind me, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I turned, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing. Just darkness and the shifting shadows of the trees. Must be an animal, I muttered to myself, forcing a chuckle. It didn't sound convincing, even to me. Still, I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, shining it into the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the dense thicket of trees and underbrush. But the feeling remained, that feeling of eyes on me, watching, waiting. I shook my head, laughing quietly at my own paranoia. I'd spent plenty of nights in the woods. This was no different. It was just the quiet playing tricks on me. I went back to my chair, trying to relax. But even as I sat down, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something lurking in the trees. I didn't sleep well that night. The next day, I tried to convince myself that it had all been in my head. After all, the forest was empty. I hadn't seen another person since I arrived, and that's exactly why I'd chosen this spot. No people, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. Still, the unease from the previous night lingered. I spent the morning hiking, hoping to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over me. The trails were beautiful, quiet, serene, but even as I walked through the towering pines, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. Several times I stopped, turning to look behind me, sure I'd heard footsteps. But every time, there was nothing, just the rustling of leaves in the wind. I pushed on, telling myself I was being ridiculous. But then, halfway through the hike, I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the trees, watching me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but it was definitely a person. Tall, unmoving, just standing there between the trees. "Hey!" I called out, waving my hand. No response. The figure didn't move. I took a few steps forward, squinting, trying to get a better look. But when I blinked, the figure was gone. I stood there for a long moment, my skin crawling. Had I imagined it? The trees cast long shadows, and it was easy for your eyes to play tricks on you in the forest. But I could have sworn I'd seen someone standing there, watching me. I hurried back to camp, the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was starting to set, casting the forest in a warm, golden light. But the shadows were longer now, darker, and the feeling of being watched had grown stronger. I spent the evening inside the RV, telling myself I was being paranoid. But when night fell, and the fire outside cast flickering shadows across the clearing, I saw him again, the man in the trees. He was standing just at the edge of the firelight, barely visible, but there. I could make out his outline, tall, unmoving, watching me. My stomach twisted with fear as I stood at the RV window, staring out at the figure. He didn't move. He didn't come closer. He just watched. I grabbed my flashlight and burst out of the RV, heart racing. "Who's there?" I shouted, shining the light toward the trees. But when the beam hit the spot where the man had been standing, there was nothing. Just empty forest. I felt the cold chill run down my spine. Something wasn't right. I stayed in the RV the rest of the night, locking the doors, my knife within arm's reach. Sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I tried to start the RV. I'd decided I'd had enough. Something was wrong out here, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. But when I turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. Panic crept in. The RV had been fine the day before, but now it wouldn't start. I checked everything I could think of, but I wasn't a mechanic. I was stranded. I spent the day trying to fix it, but nothing worked. As the sun began to set again, the dread that had been building all day reached a breaking point. I had to leave. I didn't care if I had to hike out of here. I wasn't spending another night alone with whatever was out there. But when I stepped outside, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. Carved into the trees around my campsite were strange symbols, rough, deep cuts into the bark, like someone had taken a knife and gouged them out. I didn't recognize the symbols. They weren't anything I'd ever seen before. But they were fresh. Someone, or something, had been here. That night, the man in the trees came closer. I didn't see him at first, but I could feel him. The footsteps started again, circling the camp, growing louder, more deliberate. I stayed inside the RV, gripping my knife, trying to stay calm. But then I heard the scratching. Soft at first, but then louder, scraping against the side of the RV, like something trying to get in. My breath caught in my throat as the door handle rattled. I jumped up, rushing to block the door, my hands shaking. "Go away!" I shouted, but there was no response, just the sound of the RV creaking as something pressed against it from the outside. I grabbed my flashlight and swung open the door, stepping out into the darkness. He was there, standing just feet away from me, his face hidden in shadow. The man in the trees. We stared at each other for a long moment, my heart pounding in my ears. His face was pale, expressionless, and then he smiled. A slow, unnatural grin that sent a jolt of terror through me. I stepped back, raising the flashlight. "What do you want?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, watching me, the smile never leaving his face. I swung the flashlight, but before I could hit him, he was gone. Vanished into the shadows. I ran back inside, locking the door behind me, my heart racing. The footsteps outside grew louder, pounding against the ground, circling the RV faster and faster, and then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I didn't sleep. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I packed up what I could carry and set out on foot, leaving the RV behind. I didn't care where I went, as long as it was away from here. The forest felt different as I hiked. The trees seemed to close in on me, the shadows darker, the silence heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the trees was still watching, following me, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. After hours of walking, I stumbled onto an old dirt road. Relief washed over me as I saw a car approaching in the distance. I flagged it down, and the driver, an older man, gave me a strange look as I explained my situation, but he let me in. As we drove away, I glanced back at the forest, at the place I had left behind. For just a second, I swore I saw him, the man in the trees, standing at the edge of the forest, watching me leave, and I knew, deep down, that I'd never truly escape him.